This is NPR Journal from National Public Radio.
I have found over many years, I say over 50 years, that everyone, at dinner parties, taxi drivers and on long trips, porters on trains, anyone that you talk to is interested in considering God. Everyone uses the word. Everyone, whether they deny God's existence or affirm it or doubt it. And so I think everyone has a profound intellectual interest in coming to understand what they mean by that word and what can be said about God. I think there's a tremendous intellectual interest that is satisfied by a book of the kind I wrote.
That book is curiously titled How to Think About God. He who wrote it is affectionately known as the Great Bookie, for almost obvious reasons. Dr. Mortimer Adler is the author of 18 books, all spanning a broad range of issues, significant issues like education or religion or philosophy. He wrote a book called Aristotle for Everyone. And if you don't know how to read one of his books, he has one called How to Read a Book. On this NPR Journal, we feature in part an interview Ken Myers had with Dr. Adler. This interview followed the just-published How to Think About God. But as you will hear, there are other interests.
You've written what you admit to be a very dissatisfying book, haven't you, in a sense?
Yes.
That is, if it's a successful book, it will be dissatisfying. Could you explain why?
Well, because I've tried to be as modest and moderate in my claims for what reason can do in philosophical theology as should be done. First place, I don't claim that reason can establish God's existence with certitude. I say it can only be done beyond a reasonable doubt, which is not beyond the shadow of a doubt. And secondly, the notion of God that I'm able to form by reason is a notion of God that has only metaphysical properties: supreme being, having independent, unconditioned, uncaused real existence, immaterial, notice all the negatives, immaterial, incorporeal, imperceptible, undetectable, infinite, but no moral qualities. I can't go from these metaphysical properties, from the perfection of God as a being to his moral perfection, to the attribution to God of love, of benevolent nature, just, merciful, concerned and caring, providential. Now, in religion, in all the religions of the West, the God of the philosophers is too pale a God for religious belief. One does not, in order to worship God and pray to him and rely on him and trust him and love him, he must have moral qualities as well as metaphysical properties. And these are beyond reason's power to establish.
Pascal refers to the necessity of the heart being involved.
Right. I do think I've made one thing clear, though. Most people suppose that the leap of faith which Pascal is talking about, the leap that carries you from the God of the philosophers to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Jesus, Moses, and Muhammad, that leap is a leap from having no grounds or insufficient grounds for affirming God's existence to belief in God's existence. I think that's not the case. I think we have sufficient grounds, beyond a reasonable doubt, for affirming God's existence. The leap is from the affirmation of God, the supreme being, to God, the morally perfect being, benevolent, just, and merciful. That's the leap of faith. Mm-hmm. And in addition, may I say, that in the religions of the West, the affirmation of God's existence is only one creedal point. Christians and Jews and Muslims believe in the immortality of the soul. They believe in divine revelation. They believe in divine providence. They believe in divine rewards and punishments and an afterlife. All these beliefs are the fabric of religion. It is not sufficient, even if one could establish, as I think one can't establish by reason alone, that God is just and merciful and morally good, mm-hmm. benevolent. Mm-hmm. That would not suffice for the richness of religious belief. And the proposition which is so difficult for me, I've thought a great deal about one of the great points of religious belief, namely the immortality of the soul. I think, however difficult it may be for reason to argue for God's existence, it is many, many times more difficult for reason to argue for the immortality of the soul. Mm-hmm. Mm. And without that, do you think there'd be any really vigorous religious belief in the West without that belief?
No, because there's no promise. There's no guarantee.
You may have faith, but you don't have any hope.
Right. Why did you consider relinquishing your paganism You mentioned in the prologue to your book that at a few occasions you considered becoming a Christian.
Well, I think during the late 30s and early 40s, when I was most tempted to become a convert to Christianity, I was so involved in the study of Thomas Aquinas, who wrote so many books and articles about Thomistic philosophy, that all of the persons with whom I had the association were Catholic teachers, Catholic professors, Catholic priests. And I moved very largely in after all, at the University of Chicago, I couldn't discuss the philosophy of Aquinas with any of my colleagues. So I moved out of the circle of my ordinary secular university into the religious community, and I think that vitality of that intellectual life led me to, shall I say, consider becoming religiously a Christian. I did not do so, though, for reasons it's very difficult to explain.
You dedicate the book to Etienne Gilson?
Yes.
How would you evaluate his work?
Oh, he's a tremendous historian, for one thing, and a fine philosopher. I owe to him, by the way, two things. There's his understanding of how Aquinas differs from Aristotle by being a Christian theologian, that Christianity adds insights that Aristotle couldn't have had because they come from the light of revelation and faith, not from reason. Mm-hmm. And secondly, in that context, I think I learned from him more than no one else the distinction between the relative contingency of physical things and the absolute contingency of the cosmos as a whole.
Mm-hmm. In your autobiography, you refer to the self-evident truth of human equality. Could you explain how it is so self-evident?
Well, there's only one respect in which it is true that all men are equal. Only one. And that is they're all human. Their equality is their equality as members having the species-specific properties of the human species, Homo sapiens. To say it's almost tautological to say all men are equal in that all men are equally human. They're equal in their human beingness, in their humanity, and no other respect. All being men, they are all equal in their humanity. Now that seems to me, having said that, nothing more to say. Mm-hmm. You either see it or you don't.
Mm-hmm. How would you define humanism?
Humanism? Humanism?
Yes.
Oh, that's a word that has any number of meanings.
You speak in your autobiography of establishing a liberal humanistic
educational
program. So how would you use it in that context?
Well, when I talk about was a medieval degree or a Renaissance degree, LHD, Doctor of Humane Letters. I'd like to change that to Doctor of Humane Learning. Humane learning is the learning of the generalist, not the specialist. The humanities, in fact, the Latin word humanitas, from which we get humanities, or humanistic learning, is the Latin translation of the Greek word paideia, which means general learning, the learning common to all human beings, in the learning which they should have as human beings, not as a chemist or as a lawyer or as a plumber or anything else. Specialized learning is not humane in this sense. So humanistic learning is, I'd almost identify it with the kind of learning that all men should participate in because they're men. Mm-hmm. And philosophy, by the way, is an essential part of humane learning, as poetry is. But as no particular science is. Science in general, yes, but no particular science.
And the term liberal arts has a similar concern, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. Because the liberal arts are the common arts of learning that everyone must have in order to learn. I mean, because the Middle Ages had names for them. I have, I think, a much more concrete way of describing the liberal arts. In the Middle Ages, there were grammar, rhetoric, and logic, music, astronomy, arithmetic, and geometry. But I would prefer to say that the liberal arts are the arts of reading and writing and speaking and listening, observing, measuring, and calculating. These are the arts of learning. Without them, you can't learn anything.
Above the line is complete factual knowledge.
You know everything. You could possibly know about the way the world is. Everything at all. Says you can't draw from that any conclusion.
What you're hearing briefly is a session recorded at the Aspen Institute at the Y Plantation on Maryland's eastern shore. He met with high school students for a 3-day seminar on topics from his latest book, 6 Great Ideas. Topics included truth, goodness, beauty, equality, liberty, and justice. And the examination of ideas has been part of Dr. Adler for a long time.
I think it was in 1934 or 35 that I wrote a paper for the American Catholic Philosophical Association, which I was then a member, arguing that democracy was the only perfectly just form of government. I finally had understood the reasons for that. And since then, I have been, without qualification, a committed Democrat.
What do you think would have happened to your own life if you had read a theological work instead of Mill's autobiography at the age of 15?
Well, I don't know. But let me say, I read Mill at 15 and therefore went to college. Having gone to college, I read St. Thomas at 21 or 20.
And
so very, very close. Shortly after Mill, I read Aquinas.
And St. Thomas was certainly as influential, if not.
Oh, no question about
so.
it. I have to say to you that in my first year at Columbia, I took Professor Woodbridge's course in History of Philosophy. And I'm still very proud to remember that in the examination just before Christmas on the Metaphysics of Aristotle, I did so well that Woodbridge gave me a copy of the Oxford translation inscribed to me with the words, to Mortimer Adler, who has already begun to make good use of this book. I was then 17 years old.
And now, as he approaches 80 years of age, he conducts seminars for youth.
You know everything. You could possibly know about the way the world is. Everything at all. Says you can't draw from that any conclusion about what you ought or ought not do. And his reasoning is very sound in the sense that he said, from a whole series of premises, all of which contain the words is or is not, you can't draw a conclusion which contains the words ought or ought not. How do you get around that one? Yes?
I don't remember what you said, but I think you said that it was in the fact that factual knowledge, but that we weren't depending on factual knowledge.
Why not?
When we talked about human nature. But I didn't really understand it, because I thought that human nature is kind of, knowing facts about human nature was what led us to the need.
Well, suppose you didn't know, even, let's suppose, I'm going to put in all that. All the facts about you, suppose among the facts that you know are all the facts about human nature, including the facts about all our natural needs. Hume still says, no matter how many is statements you make, all of them true, no matter how many is statements you make, no matter how many descriptive statements you make, you can't draw a single ought or prescriptive conclusion. You follow me, what he's saying? Mm-hmm. So I'm willing to put above the line, in factual knowledge, I'm going to get all the statements about human nature, and I still think Hume has the answer. The answer. Can anyone guess the answer on this one? Yes.
The needs are the truth, and it's also true that the needs are desired. So.
Well, that would be all on the factual side. Now, I guess the answer involves a point in logic that you might not see. Let me tell you this point in logic. In order to draw an ought conclusion, from a series of premises, one of the premises has to be an ought premise. You follow me? Mm-hmm. Let's put it this way, from two is's, you can't draw any ought. From two oughts, you can't draw any is either. See? Only from an ought and an is, only from an ought and an is can you draw an ought. And so you have to have, in order to avoid Hume's difficulty, one first self-evident prescriptive ought, to which you then add some facts, and then draw some ought conclusions. Let me show you how you do that. Suppose you now know what needs are, and what real goods are, and I say to you, I'm going to give you a proposition that is just as self-evident now as the proposition about triangles and diagonals or wholes and parts.
You ought to seek whatever is really good for you.
And those are needs.
Whatever you ought to seek. Just and the way to test that is try to say the opposite. You ought to seek whatever is really bad for you. Really bad for you, not appears. Or you ought not to seek whatever is really good for you. Can you say either of those two things? Can you think them really? You can't, can you? Hence, when you get the notion of ought to, it is connected with real good, just as ought not is connected with real bad. See? So that ought to means real good means ought to, just like whole part, greater than, or no diagonals in a triangle. Now, given that first premise, it's the only one you need. You ought to seek whatever is really good for you. Minor premise. Knowledge is really good for you. What? You need it. Hence, you ought to seek knowledge. Notice the reasoning? You ought to seek whatever is really good for you. A matter of fact, knowledge is good for you. Why? Because, in fact, you do need it. Conclusion, you ought to seek knowledge. And that's the whole, in that simple diagram I've just given you, is the whole essence of all moral reasoning. But you don't get any of it without that first premise. And then, now what's the trouble with it? What's the difference?
How did you have to prepare for the seminars?
Well, our counselors just came and talked to us, and they had chosen 8 people that they wanted to go. And then they gave us the book about a month before we came here, and we just read it.
You just read it. Do you know Dr. Adler has written a book called How to Read a Book?
I knew he wrote it, but I haven't read it.
You've not been in anything like this before, I gather.
Not a seminar. I had a philosophy class that was smaller, and there we discussed things like this, too.
But you haven't had a teacher grill you like this.
Not on these subjects, at least, yeah.
You seem to enjoy it a lot, though.
I do, yeah.
Why?
I like the ideas, and they kind of fascinate me. I've always enjoyed it, and it's just fun for me to be here in something like this and be able to hear what other people are thinking and what somebody experienced like he thinks.
What difference does this make when you go back to school next Tuesday? What difference does something like this make for you?
You mean to my classes? I'm not really sure that it would make that much, at least to the way I participated there, because it's so different. In my regular class, we don't have discussions like this, and there isn't a way I could apply it there.
Do you think it would be better if you had discussions like this from time to time in regular classes?
No, I think if all the students in my class were students like this, it would be, but there are maybe 3 students in a class of 35 who would actually read the material and really think about it. So I don't think there would be much value to 3 people talking about it and the rest of the class sitting back and not knowing what was going on.
How are most of your classes conducted then? Are they strictly lectures then?
Yeah, I have a really good lecture course, and I think that's what all of them. In the past, I had some that were discussion, but they were never in depth like this, and we never got that much of a chance to express conflicting opinions. It was more everybody agreeing on the same thing.
Do you think you're going to learn more in a setting like this than you would in a setting like your normal school day?
Yeah, but I'm not learning the same kind of things. I mean, I'm learning math at school, and I think the math class that I have teaches me math in just about the best way. Maybe it doesn't teach me all the concepts, but you have to know the basics before you can ever get to the concepts. And
have you learned something about how to learn when in this kind of setting?
yeah, I guess it's kind of opened my mind a little bit.
How so?
Just listening and realizing that there's so many different people who have so many different ideas. I'm not used to that. It's sort of, if anybody can make a case for something, then that something is just accepted by other people, and it isn't here. And that's nice.
Why is that nice? Is it good? Is it true?
Oh, no. It's beautiful. No. It's good because I think people really think about their own opinions more, and they have more basis for them. they aren't just accepting what seems like the most likely thing, the closest thing at hand. They have things to choose between.
So they have to have reasons for
Yeah.
accepting it. And normally you don't think?
Not as much. I don't think the average person really does as much.
Earlier, we'd mentioned that this interview with Dr. Adler came after the publication of his book, How to Think About God. But that is not what he's famous for, what his biography lists. He's chairman of the Encyclopedia Britannica's board of editors. He's a man who organized the Great Books of the Western World series. Finally, he's a man who makes you think. At the end of this upcoming interview, we're going to give you a book list that should keep you occupied for 10 years.
I'd like to refer to a few other details from your autobiography.
Yeah.
Keeping along with the theme of philosophy and theology.
Yep.
You said that you wished, or you, at the time of the writing of the book, you wished that you had included, among others, Calvin among the authors in the
Yes.
Great Books of the Western World. Could you explain why?
Well, I think, though I don't think Calvin is as great a theologian as Aquinas or Augustine, I do think the tradition of Protestant theological thought should have been represented in the great books, and the Institutes of the Christian Religion by Calvin is probably Luther was not a theologian at all, as you know.
Mm-hmm.
He was anti-theological, anti-rational. He called reason that great whore, you know.
Mm-hmm.
But Calvin was a theologian, and not too far off from Augustine, as a matter of fact. I think we should have included the Institutes of the Christian Religion.
Would you consider him to be one of the greater minds of history, or was he merely an encyclopedist?
Well, if the measure is, would some essential wisdom be lost if Calvin had not written the Institutes of the Christian Religion, my answer is no. No essential wisdom would have been lost.
Calvin really drew quite a bit on Augustine.
No question about it.
What about, speaking of Protestant theologians, what about Jonathan Edwards?
Oh, he was on the question of grace and free will, he was an extraordinary, lively and active thinker. I think his theory of freedom is wrong, but a very interesting writer indeed.
There are some who consider him one of America's better philosophers.
I don't think there's any question about it. He's a very important figure in American intellectual life.
Yet, unfortunately, he's also been
Ignored.
ignored,
Right.
primarily because of bad associations with his sermons, I believe.
I think so.
What is the relationship between theology and metaphysics?
Well, if you realize that in a book, the word metaphysics, of course, is a word that simply means first philosophy, or philosophia prima, that branch of philosophy which is concerned with the one subject of being, existence. What does it mean for anything to be? And therefore, the concluding chapters of metaphysics are theology. They're concerned with that special being which is God. So that philosophical theology is really a chapter in metaphysics.
And yet, philosophy... What about the relationship then between philosophy and metaphysics? Would you consider metaphysics to be necessary to the
metaphysics is talking now in terms of chapters, as it were.
Right.
Speculative philosophy, practical philosophy is mainly ethics and politics. Speculative philosophy begins with the philosophy of nature and then goes beyond the philosophy of nature to metaphysical questions and ends up with theological questions. It's one continuum, really.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if you take Aristotle's, the two great speculative books of Aristotle, the Physics and the Metaphysics, they're really continuous. The Metaphysics has the same fundamental notions that are found in the Physics, only it carries them beyond the concern with change and the phenomena of change, space and time, which is the main concern of physics, and it goes on to other forms of being and ends up with the 12th book of Aristotle's Metaphysics is concerned with God. Because Aristotle has a very, I think, inadequate notion of God and a very inadequate argument for God's existence.
Both modern science and modern philosophy have ignored the pursuit of metaphysics.
Oh, yes. But see, modern philosophy, when it thinks of metaphysics, thinks of German philosophy at the end of the 19th century. I mean, in the 19th century, it thinks of Hegel and Schleiermacher and Fichte. That's what they think metaphysics is. The contemporary philosopher who was anti-metaphysics, let's say A.J. Ayer, who writes against metaphysics, hasn't the faintest notion of what Aristotle is dealing with in his book. He didn't talk about that kind of thing at all.
How has that affected the pursuit of, well, the pursuit of science as well as the pursuit of philosophy? Does it affect empirical science at all?
No, I don't think so.
Does it affect the philosophy of science?
Can I ask you what the word, when you say does it, what does it refer to?
Does the refusal to deal with metaphysics or the refusal to come to terms with metaphysical understanding affect the philosophy of science?
I think slightly, yes, but not profoundly. Where I think the absence of metaphysics is most important is it has a bearing on our moral and political notions, curiously enough.
You stated that during your tempestuous career at the University of Chicago, at one point you and Robert Hutchins affirmed the necessity of reestablishing metaphysics as a unifying area of study within the liberal arts. Am I correct in quoting
You're
that?
correct in saying that, and I think we were quite wrong.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think at the time that Hutchins, who said that, he really said it. I didn't say it at the time, but I supported him in saying it. I don't think that's correct. I don't think you need metaphysics metaphysics as such as a unifying principle in the university. I think, however, that philosophy, because philosophy is in my view, there are two meanings of the word philosophy. There's philosophy as it's now conducted in most philosophy departments, which is a highly specialized, highly technical subject, as specialized and technical as mathematics is. That certainly is not a unifying principle in the university. But philosophy, in my sense, which is quite different from that, philosophy, which I call everybody's business, is the consideration of the great ideas, of all the great ideas. And that is, I think, essential to the intellectual community of a university.
Does philosophy in that sense involve the pursuit of truth? Is that too grand?
Oh, no, it doesn't. It certainly involves the pursuit of truth and particularly the attempt at clarifying our understanding of the world in which we live.
Well, we have exactly 50 seconds left. I'd like to thank you very much. And one
Thank
last
you.
question.
Yes.
Almost a silly one. You'll forgive me. If you had to take one book with you on the proverbial desert island, which book would it be? For a man who has made up so many book lists in his time, this is probably a terrible question.
I could give you a list of 10, but one is very hard.
Could you give me 10 very quickly?
Oh, yes, I can give you 10 very easily.
Okay.
Thucydides, History of the Peloponnesian War, Plato's 5 or 6 of Plato's dialogues, Aristotle's Ethics and Politics, Augustine's Confessions, Plutarch's Lives, Dante's Divine Comedy, some plays of Shakespeare, Montaigne's Essays, Gulliver's Travels, Locke's dissertation on second treatise on civil government, and Tolstoy's War and Peace.
Okay, that's our reading list for our listeners for the weekend.
Takes 10 years. That would hold you for 10 years on a desert island.
Okay. Thank you very much. I hope we can speak again when your next book comes out.
Thank you very much indeed.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Dr. Mortimer Adler. He was in conversation with NPR's Ken Myers. This has been NPR Journal. Funds for this program are made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. I'm Frank Stasio. This is NPR, National Public Radio.